Imagine a world where every word in a sacred text is not just a story but a hidden code, a puzzle waiting to be unraveled. This is the world of Origen, a towering figure in early Christian scholarship, who saw the Bible as a vast, intricate tapestry of symbols and metaphors. In the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus tells the parable of the laborers in the vineyard, a seemingly simple tale about workers hired at different times of the day, all receiving the same wage. To the modern reader, these laborers are just characters in a story, a parable or an allegory. But for Origen, they represented something far deeper. The stages of Israel's history, from Adam to the present day. This is a reminder that what we often consider the literal sense of a text can already be allegorical. Parables use characters as symbols, and Origen, a master of allegorical interpretation, took this a step further, seeing in every detail a hidden spiritual truth. Origen was not just a biblical interpreter. He was a biblical scholar and critic in a modern sense. Born around 185 CE in Alexandria, Egypt, Origen grew up in a Christian household and was deeply influenced by the intellectual milieu of his time. Unlike many of his contemporaries, who accepted the Greek Old Testament, the Septuagint, without question, Origen was aware of the differences between the Greek and Hebrew texts. He knew that the Septuagint was a translation, and that it sometimes diverged from the original Hebrew. This awareness led him to study Hebrew with Jewish contemporaries, making him one of the first Christian scholars to engage seriously with the Hebrew Bible. One of Origen's most ambitious projects was the Hexapla, a massive work that compared 6 versions of the Old Testament, the Hebrew text, a transliteration of the Hebrew into Greek, the Septuagint, and 3 other Greek translations by Aquila, Symmachus, and Theodore. The Hexapla was a gargantuan undertaking, consisting of about 6,000 pages and possibly only a single copy. Its purpose was to help scholars and readers understand the differences between the various texts and to arrive at the best possible readings. Origen marked variations in the Septuagint, noting where it differed from the Hebrew original, and even suggested that New Testament writers like Paul sometimes quoted the Old Testament from memory or modified it to fit their purposes. Origen was also acutely aware of the discrepancies between the Gospels. He noted that while the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, describe Jesus' baptism followed by 40 days of fasting and temptation, John's Gospel omits the temptation and presents a different chronology. Origen argued that these contradictions were not accidental but intentional, designed to convey spiritual meanings. For him, the discrepancies did not undermine the truth of the Gospels, but rather pointed to deeper, mystical interpretations. This approach allowed him to reconcile the differences and see the Gospels as a cohesive whole, each contributing to a broader spiritual narrative. For Origen, the Gospels were not just historical accounts but living texts, rich with symbolic and spiritual significance. He believed that the evangelists, in their writing, transposed events and modified details to achieve their mystical ends. This perspective is quite different from that of modern critics, who often use discrepancies to argue for the separate integrity of each gospel and the need to reconstruct the historical Jesus. Origen's approach, however, was more holistic, seeing the Gospels as a unified, spiritually coherent whole. In the following century, a school of interpreters emerged in Antioch, Syria, that challenged Origen's allegorical approach. The Antiochene school, represented by figures like John Chrysostom, Theodore of Mopsuestia, and Theodore of Tarsus, emphasized a more literal and historical reading of the Bible. They were trained in rhetoric and literary analysis, and they applied these skills to the biblical texts, seeking to understand the flow of arguments and the narrative coherence of the passages. The Antiochenes were concerned with the moral and spiritual edification of the text. They wanted to ensure that the Bible had something to say about everyday life, much like the Jewish concern for halakha, the practical application of religious law. They were not opposed to allegory per se, but they resisted the type of allegory that destroyed textual coherence. For them, the text was not a pretext for something else, but a meaningful, well-structured narrative. One of the Antiochenes, Theodore, for example, interpreted the title of Psalm 30, a psalm, a song at the dedication of the temple, as referring to the restoration of human nature that Christ accomplished by his death and resurrection. This interpretation, while allegorical, still respected the narrative and thematic coherence of the text. The Antiochenes sought to find meaning in the Bible that was relevant to the lives of their readers, rather than reducing it to a collection of symbolic fragments. The Antiochenes were also concerned with the hypothesis of Scripture, the overall thrust or drift of the text. They believed that the Bible should be read within the context of the Church's rule of faith, which provided an interpretative framework. This approach was not about literalism as such, but about finding a meaningful, coherent interpretation that aligned with the broader Christian tradition. The differences between Origen and the Antiochenes should not be exaggerated. While they diverged on the interpretation of obscure Old Testament passages, they often agreed on the Pauline letters and the Gospels. Both Origen and the Antiochenes were concerned with the flow of argument and the narrative coherence of the texts. Origen did not allegorize Paul, but explained his train of thought, and the Antiochenes did the same. In discursive texts like the letters, both approaches aimed to understand the sequence and flow of the argument. The world of early Christian biblical interpretation is a rich and complex tapestry of thought, where figures like Origen and the Antiochenes sought to understand the deep, hidden meanings of the sacred texts. Their approaches, while different, were both driven by a deep reverence for the Bible and a desire to find spiritual and moral truth. Whether through the allegorical lens of Origen or the more literal and historical approach of the Antiochenes, the goal was always to make the Bible relevant and meaningful to the lives of their readers. In the end, what united them was a shared commitment to the transformative power of the Word.